So thank you everybody for being here, joining us in this second webinar of the year of the International Institute for Religious Freedom. My name is Marcela Bordon. I'm the program officer of the International Institute for Religious Freedom, and we are going to talk about in this session about the new issue of the International Journal for Religious Freedom. I'm going to explain a little bit about the dynamics. Then I'm going to introduce the moderator of the session, who is the Professor Janet Epp Buckingham. In this session, in this format of the webinar, all attendees have the opportunity to share their questions and opinions by two ways: by the chat, from the Zoom chat you have done in your panel, and in the section of the Q&A with this little button with the two bubbles. And after each presentation, because each speaker will introduce about their articles and about what they were developing on as part of the authors of this special volume. And after their presentation, I will be reading these questions and sharing your comments to the speakers, and we will have the chance to have the feedback from them. Anyway, if you have some questions for different speakers and maybe you want to share them until the end of the session, you can always share them in the Q&A or the chat, and we will send in these questions to the speakers and maybe we can share some answers by mail. So I'm going to introduce the moderator of this session, the Professor Janet Epp Buckingham. She is an associate professor at the Trinity Western University and director of the Laureate Leadership Center. She has lived and studied in England, France, and South Africa. And it was while studying at Bible College and working with the Jubilee Center at Cambridge, England, that she developed this passion for applying Christian principles to public policy. Dr. Buckingham served as an advocacy role in the Executive Director of Christian Legal Fellowship and the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada as General Legal Counsel and Director and Law Public Policy Advisor. She is now the Executive Director of the International Journal for Religious Freedom, so she will be the right person here to introduce each of you for what do we do with the journal, what was the focus of this special volume. So I give the microphone for Professor Janet.
Thank you very much, Marcela. It's very, very much a pleasure to be with all of you today to introduce the latest issue of the International Journal for Religious Freedom. I need to update my my bio with Marcela. I'm actually retired from Trinity Western University as a full professor, and I'm now a professor emeritus at Trinity Western University. And I do have another role as Director of Global Advocacy with the World Evangelical Alliance. So I'm very much engaged in global advocacy, specifically on religious freedom. That has been long an academic interest of mine, and I'm pleased to be able to engage in advocacy for those who are persecuted for their faith around the world. So still very much engaged on the advocacy side. I have been the executive editor for the journal since the 2015 issue, so coming up on 10 years in the editorial role. It has been a great learning experience for me as advocates and practitioners and academics all submit articles on a wide variety of issues. The important aspect of this journal is we are very much for religious freedom. So while the journal is interdisciplinary and we have people from a variety of different faith perspectives, all of the articles are going to be promoting religious freedom and in favor of robust religious freedom from around the world. The journal is published twice a year. Many of our issues are special themed issues that come out of conference presentations, and often the organizer of the conference will end up being in a guest editor role. But about every 3 issues, we have a general issue, and that is what this particular issue is it's a general issue. And it is often more eclectic. It doesn't necessarily start with a particular theme. And you will see that the articles in this issue cover a wide range of topics. We have our very first ever poem that someone submitted on a religious freedom theme, which I thought was a very interesting contribution to have in an academic journal. We also have articles specifically on religious freedom situations in China, India, and North Korea. We have an apologetics article and one that is more focused on philosophy, theology. So there's really something for everyone in this issue, and I commend it to you. The journal is available online at IIRF.org. It's also available through EBSCOhost and Sabinet. So some typical, more academic, through search engines, you will find the articles, but our articles are all posted online on a dedicated website for the journal. Well, enough about the journal. I am very thrilled with this particular issue and very happy to have 3 of the authors with us today to introduce their articles. We've had some challenges with people connecting, so I'm going to introduce and give the floor to the ones as they are here. This is actually not uncommon in webinars, as various people have different kinds of internet issues, but I'm very happy that we have 3 speakers, and so we will take them in the order that they are going to be available. So first I'm going to turn to Timo Schmitz. Timo holds an MA in philosophy and political science from Trier University in Germany, and he's currently pursuing his PhD studies at that university. He's the founder and chief editor of the Journal of Ethno-Philosophical Questions and Global Ethics, which no doubt has some also very interesting content. He has a very wide range of interests, one of which is North Korea, which is the subject of the article that he submitted to the journal. But he also has a very strong interest in languages and speaks multiple languages, and a really great interest in religions in all their varieties. So perhaps he embodies some pluralistic principles that we espouse as a foundation for religious freedom, is religious pluralism. So Timo, I'm going to turn the floor to you and look forward to your presentation to us.
Thank you. I'm very glad and I'm very happy to have the opportunity to make the presentation. I just need to have the permission to share my screen. I don't have that permission yet.
Yes, give me a second. I will.
No problem.
I'm sorry, technical issues.
In the meantime, I want to thank Professor Janet Epp Buckingham for giving me the great opportunity. She really was very supportive in the publishing process and very helpful. I'm very glad about this. And I also want to give my thanks to the IIRF for making such an event. I'm very glad about that. So yes, now it.
Now you can?
Yes.
Okay, great.
You should start any second. You can see it?
Yes.
Okay.
Perfect.
Perfect. So I'm going to talk about the question, a path toward religious freedom in the DPRK. Is it possible? The content of my presentation will be, we will first talk about the country details so that you all know what the country is all about. Then we will talk about the Tutsi idea and its basic principles that stands toward religion. The religious situation from 1945 to 1957, especially in the context of eradication versus remnant theories. And then I will present the three major religions of the DPRK, which is Buddhism, Judaism, and Christianity, and its representative associations. And in the end, I will introduce a 6-point plan for improvement and come to a conclusion. I want to make clear at the beginning, just that you don't wonder, I use the official diplomatic names, which means DPRK, Democratic People's Republic of Korea for North Korea, and ROK, or Republic of Korea for South Korea. So what is the country about? The official name is Democratic People's Republic of Korea, and better known as North Korea. It has a population of 25 million people, with 4 million people living in the capital, Pyongyang. The country declares itself to be a Tutsi-based socialist democracy, but the factual state form is actually neo-feudalism under a hereditary de facto monarch, which is the supreme leader, Kim Jong-un, since the end of 2011. He got this office from his father, Kim Jong-il, and other important figures of historical importance are Kim Il-sung, which is Kim Jong-un's grandfather, and Kim Jong-suk, which is his grandmother. Concerning the party system, it's actually a 3-party system, but it is completely synchronized. It is a completely synchronized bloc under the total leadership of the Korean Workers' Party, abbreviated KWP in this presentation. The state ideology is Tutsi idea. Well, what is Tutsi idea? It is the constitutional state ideology since 1972 and claims to be a holistic thought. And it claims to be the true philosophy, but in fact, it lacks philosophical inquiry. Tutsi accepts that there are different worldviews, but declares that the Tutsiist worldview is the only true worldview, which means that Tutsi denies any form of pluralism, and thus, in fact, it is a closed ideology which exists simply to be followed. There is no input from citizens possible. The very basic principle of Tutsi is that man is master of everything and decides everything. This is the very basic credo of this whole thought. However, there is no individual independence, but it is diminished to national independence. So though it says that man is an independent being and shapes his fate on his own, and that man is the master of the revolution, in fact, being independent means that as long as the nation is not influenced by foreign powers, the citizens are free. The revolutionary cause must be upheld by the so-called Democratic Front, which is the party bloc under state control, and the principle, one of the main principles is the leader principle, which means that the supreme leader is supervising the revolution. One of the very, very basic or most important slogans that you will hear about the DPRK is Ilshim Tankyol. It means single-minded unity, and that's what actually Tutsi is all about. It means to make a wholehearted unity with the supreme leader, so every single person should think uniform and be a part, be a single small part of this big machine, so that we have to think the people or the country like a single human being with the leader as its brain. And it is even that important that you find the slogan Ilshim Tankyol at the building blocks next to the monument that's dedicated to the Tutsi idea, the Tutsi Tower. Now, the stance toward religion. Tutsi itself is declared to be scientific per definition, while religion is not. And it denies any kind of idealistic thought. So in fact, Tutsi should be thought to be a materialistic philosophy, though in fact it is not, because it has a quasi-divine position of the Kim family integrated, which means that there are divine elements, the veneration of the Kim family, yet it has a hostile attitude toward religion, since per ideology, it denies any form of idealistic thought and that which transcends matter. Now, the religious situation from 1945 to 1957, we have to note that the North-South division happened in 1945 and was finalized with the end of the Korean War in 1953. In the beginning, before the Korean War, especially in the first 2 years, the communists cooperated with progressive religious forces. And in 1946, they even founded the Chondoist Youth Party, which represents the Chondoist religion. Kim Il-sung, in his memoirs, even spoke positive of religion, though he personally rejected any form of religion. It should not be surprising that he has a certain positive thought of religion because he has a Christian background himself, and the Kim family has a Christian background. And Kim Il-sung himself in his youth time was an organist in his church community, but he later rejected any form of religion and became an atheist. And in 1957, even before the division, by the way, and in 1957, there was the beginning of anti-religious campaigns in the DPRK. So the end of the 50s was a very tragic caesura for religious people in the DPRK. Now, there are two ways to explain what happened then. The first are eradication theories, which claim that the government successfully eradicated all forms of religion on its territory during the 1957 anti-religious campaigns. And the second are remnant theories, which say that despite the anti-religious campaigns, religion has always been present in some form in the DPRK, and that the eradication theories are nothing but a Cold War narrative. And to put it in a nutshell, Ryu summed it up perfectly. The evidence for the persecution eradication models is not altogether trustworthy. So there has, I argue that there has always been some form of religion in the DPRK, in whatever form it has been. Now, in 1972, the situation for believers changed again because Marxism-Leninism was diminished in a constitution and Zutze was introduced as a constitutional principle. In this year, the first religious organizations were refounded. However, this does not mean that free practice of religion was possible. In fact, the religious bodies which were founded or refounded were and are under tight supervision until today. Now, Buddhism is represented by the Korean Buddhist Association. It was founded in 1972. And the thing with Buddhism is that it's all about relieving suffering or overcoming suffering and becoming an enlightened being. So the religion can be flattened, the metaphysics can be flattened and a kind of materialized or more brought to the immanence. And thus, it is not really in competition with the divine position of the Kims. So they took part in mutual North-South dialogues, in inter-Korean religious dialogues, and in international partnerships, and are probably the most active organized, Buddhism is the most active organized religion in the DPRK today. While Chondoism is a native religion of Korea, it is represented by the Chondoist Youth Party, which was founded on 8 February 1946, and the Chondo Church Committee, which is closely allied and hardly separable from them, was founded in either 1972 or 1974. We are not too sure on this. However, the Chondoist religion, was founded by Confucian reformer Chue Tzu during the Ri Dynasty. And the key teaching is that God is in man, or God and man, they are indivisible. However, if a man does evil deeds, he distances from God. And so again, this religion can be brought to an immanent stage or can be flattened in metaphysics by making the Kim family the most virtuous and perfectioned man, and thus giving them a special status as being the closest to heaven. And in addition, Chondoism, because it is a native religion, is treasured as cultural heritage. However, there's no independent religious practice possible. Now, the thing is with Christianity. Christianity in no way can be materialized or brought on an immanent stance because the belief in Jesus Christ as Savior is a necessary precondition. Thus, it is a 100% religion relying on transcendence. Jesus is therefore in a competitive position with the Kim family. In the DPRK, there are 3 church bodies present, which are the Korean Christian Association, the Korean Catholic Association, and the Korean Orthodox Commission. The DPRK is targeted by stakeholders of the IIRK and foreign countries, especially in regards of Christianity. And even though there's a dire situation in the DPRK for Christians, Christian defectors cannot be regarded as an objective source, since they often receive considerable resources from evangelical organizations in the IIRK. And I want to quote Chung, 2016, on page 128, quote, "Nearly all the megachurches in the Seoul metropolitan area run special support programs for North Korean migrants. The programs serve as contact zone in which established South Korean evangelicals can project, experiment, and develop migrant-tailored services, as well as missionary training that are potentially applicable to future missionary work in North Korea," end of quote. So they are one of the main resource givers for defectors or migrants from the DPRK. So they are not completely objective. Now, going to the Korean Christian Association, it was originally founded in the late 1940s, then was abolished and refounded in 1972. It is the Protestant church body and runs 2 churches, Pongsu and Chilgol, as well as the Pyongyang Theological Seminary together with the IIRK's Methodist Association. They train house church leaders, printed Bibles and hymns in the past, and also took part in inter-Korean dialogue and international partnerships. The Korean Catholic Association was founded much later in 1988 and is not really in contact with the Vatican, or not a Vatican-sponsored organization. It runs the Changchul Cathedral, the only cathedral in North Korea. And even though they have no official contacts to the Vatican, they have sent 4 students in the near past, to Rome to study Catholic theology, so that they would have a clergy. The Korean Catholic Association takes part in inter-Korean dialogue and has international partnerships. And last but not least, the Korean Orthodox Commission was established in 2003. It is the Russian Orthodox Church body and runs the Church of Life-Giving Trinity. The clergy itself is all North Korean, but again, they were sent to study in Russia to study theology, and then came back to the DPRK. However, the church itself only serves the Russian community in Pyongyang, especially diplomats, and there are no North Korean converts known. So it is rather a sign of friendship between the DPRK and the Russian Federation. All these religious bodies have to join the Council of the Religionists. It's the name that the DPRK uses in its English publications. We could also say it's a council of of the religion bodies, or the heads of the religion bodies. They were founded in 1989 and is headed by the Jeondoist Church, and it supervises the religious associations of the party, of the DPRK, and is supervised by the party institution, the United Front Department of the Central Committee of the Workers' Party of Korea. So they are in the intermediate between the party and each individual church organization or religious organization. However, what this council exactly does, its activities, remain mainly a black box to us. So as outsiders, we do not know what are their tasks exactly. So what is to be done? I propose a 6-point plan for improvement. The first point is that religious organizations can continue to make important contributions to the inter-Korean dialogue. This dialogue might help to strengthen human rights. Second, religious institutions of the DPRK should be treated as serious religious institutions and not dismissed as mere propaganda. These bodies might play a stronger role in liberalization processes. Third, All citizens must have the right to join these religious institutions. Therefore, we must encourage the DPRK to open up religious institutions to the whole public. The DPRK must become transparent on this issue for international observers, and because the DPRK propaganda claims that everyone is free to join a religious group, but this is not true. So they have to become transparent how and who can join a religious group and make it possible for everyone to join such a religious group if they want to join. 4, foreign interference in the structures of religious institutions should be avoided. The Korean people should be able to organize themselves, and the risk of religious institutions being abused by foreign interests, contrary to those of the Korean people, must be avoided. 5, to win the trust of the DPRK government, the churches must follow the guidelines of the Workers' Party of Korea, the WPK. The WPK, in turn, must recognize all worldviews as legitimate. And the 6th point is that it is absolutely possible to establish a socialist Christianity in Korea. The WPK can be inspired by example of socialist Christians in other countries. If the country wants to go the socialist way, because right now they're not really socialist at all. You have to be aware of that. So the core of the 6-point plan are 2 things. It's first the encouragement of liberties and the exchange between religious groups and foreign counterparts without infiltrating the DPRK. An important fact, in my point of view, is that it is unreasonable to expect that the DPRK will give up the core of its existence as a counterforce opposing the United States and Western states. So we simply cannot exclude the values of the WPK unless we want to wait for regime change. So I want to make a conclusion, draw a conclusion in the end. There is religious activity in the DPRK, but all activities are tightly supervised. Religious bodies in the DPRK are strongly intertwined with politics. There have been several talks between DPRK religious bodies and their southern counterparts in the past, and despite Kim Jong-un's announcement that he will not consider reunification with the ROK or continue rapprochement, the hope for inter-Korean activities between religious bodies should not be abandoned and the channels should not be dismissed. Meanwhile, we should not stop appealing to the DPRK to relax its tight controls, and we should continue monitoring the situation. We have to avoid that religious channels are used as a means of infiltration by foreign powers to ensure that the ruling party is able to establish a trust in religious activities within the country. Religious persecution might be relaxed only if the regime trusts religious adherents and their loyalty to the party. Finally, the DPRK could look at other countries as role models demonstrating a coexistence between Christianity and socialism. I would think like of China or Cuba, where there is a certain coexistence if the DPRK wants to go a socialist path at all. So that's it, and I want to thank you all for your attention.
Thank you, Timo, for your presentation. Now we are going to invite for the attendees to share the question. Maybe you have some comments you have under disposal the chat and the Q&A section here in the panel of the Zoom. Or maybe the panelists, maybe you have some questions for Timo, maybe some comments.
Well, I thought I would maybe kick things off, maybe to encourage others to add their questions to the Q&A section. But you know, from what I have heard, and you know, we know very little about North Korea because it is so closed. And what we do here doesn't lead me to believe that it's easy for anybody to talk to the government. And I guess I'm wondering, you know, from your research, are there avenues where people can, you know, where a religious leader or a group of religious leaders might be able to connect with the government to be able to build that trust. Because certainly we have heard about religious leaders who have been, imprisoned in work camps and that kind of thing. And it doesn't, if I was a religious leader, I might be a little reluctant to make any overture to the government with fear that might attract a certain level of scrutiny and possible time in jail.
Well, the first thing is, I think that, yes, there's no one to talk to, like, who could talk to the government. For this reason, I made the 6-point plan not based on any like policy interaction between states at first, because we can see that there will be like no solution of different states acting in this situation. It all did not work out. However, I believe that there are certain, or that there were, at least I can see that there were certain efforts. We saw this in the North-South conversation. So on the one hand, you have real religious bodies and representatives. And on the other hand, you also have the Southern counterparts, and they have engaged in different activity in the past. But this is also always because they're so close to politics. The question is always how well the DPRK and the ROK get along with another, especially in times where there were leftist governments in the southern part. It was like rather close. There were more mutual benefits, and in times with conservative governments like under Lee Myung-bak and Park Geun-hye, things were quite tense, and this also made the situation more difficult. I think the thing is, even though there's no possible to have a free religion there right now. We have house churches which are government approved. They train house church leaders, but everything is closely supervised. So there are certain structures. There are structures in the DPRK. So the thing is that there are people we can talk to, religious people we can talk to. And I think that's the important thing, that especially the inter-Korean talks will get more efforts, or that they will resume talks at all. That's the first step. But I think that is something where we have to appeal to soft reforms to DPRK. We cannot, many people said one has just to wait till regime change and everything will change. But this was predicted since 2002, I guess. And until now, this regime is still alive. So I would not want to wait for a regime change. I would appreciate every little step. And so it is important that the government does not get the impression that religion will be used by foreigners to infiltrate the government system. This is very important to build that trust.
So we have received a few questions in the Q&A section. I don't know if you see them, Timo.
Wait, let me see.
There's
Okay, yes. I missed on what scholarly background you developed your article. Well, you can see the sources in my article itself. It's published in the IIRF, where you can see the scholarly basis. And there are articles, actually a lot of articles, which talk on the phases of persecution. Especially there is a lot of literature in the ROK discussing the eradication theories versus the remnant theories. Just for time reasons, I could not go into this in detail, and also in the article, I cannot go into this too much in detail because I want to focus more on the modern situation. But there have been scholarly discussions why it is reasonable to prefer the remnant theories. There have also been delegations to the DPRK from South Korea, so from the Republic of Korea, which had with people working there, like Buddhist monks, which cooperated there. So in the beginning, many people who arrived there first thought that religion was eradicated, but something which observers who stayed there for some time saw is that religion, no matter how odd it is really not one-to-one like in the South. It's not one-to-one like in the West. It is highly politicized. In the church service, the Kims are praised a lot and prayed for them and everything. So it is highly politicized, but they are true believers, and that's what we have to build on. And there are scholarly articles which go into this in detail. And I cited them. You can read my article. You can also look into the sources. There are very, very interesting articles, especially on Buddhism. There was a very interesting one, but also on the discussion about Christianity. So there is a lot of material. Yes, the second question, my denomination established a yogurt factory in North Korea in 2004, training local workers and establishing a needed food source. Are you aware of other projects of this nature? Yes, there is. There is, for example, a private university or a private third sector institution, which is led by Christians, or which was founded by Christians, and the founder itself is from the IIRK, and they help training people in, let's say, unpolitical jobs, like technical jobs, natural science, something like that. I don't know the subjects themselves, but I know that they have foreign professors, foreign staff, and the nature why they do this is purely Christian, because people in the DPRK are also human beings like you and me. So they are also just human, and training them in subjects is their passion. That's one example. I also heard that there was a noodle factory, which was a cooperation between a church in the US and in the DPRK. However, the situation when US citizens were asked to return to the US after the death of Otto Warmbier, after that, I don't know if this cooperation continues. It was also for that university project a problem, because professors from the US could not re-enter the DPRK. So in fact, sanctions are also constraint to cooperation, because there are denominations willing to cooperate, and there are also the country is willing to let their church organization cooperate with foreign organization. So these cooperations exist. A final example is the car company. They have Pyeonghwa Motor, and it was originally a joint venture between the Korean Unification Church and DPRK business. But I think that also this joint venture is dissolved right now. The church gave its shares to the North Korean counterpart, but there have been cooperations also with churches.
Well, thank you very much, Timo. That has been very interesting, and thank you to those who asked some very interesting and probing questions. Timo, you obviously have some good knowledge of some other cultural things and what Christians are doing in North Korea. So that's a great addition to the conversation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, next, we are going to turn to Dr. Paul Rowe. I'm very pleased to introduce him because he's one of my colleagues at Trinity Western University. He's Professor of International Studies and Director of the International Institute for Religious Freedom, Vancouver. He teaches in the fields of international politics, the developing world, the Middle East, and South Asia. His primary research interests focus on religion and global politics, particularly in the Middle East and South Asia. I'll let him explain how he came to be the primary author on an article about China. He pursues an interest in religion. He is a Canadian citizen, studied at the University of Toronto and Dalhousie before earning his PhD in political science at McGill University. He has spent extended time living and traveling in the Middle East and India. He's the author of Religion and Global Politics and the editor of the Routledge Handbook of Minorities in the Middle East, among other works. So over to you, Paul.
Yeah, thank you, Janet. I want to thank you for inviting me to speak today, and I really appreciate Dr. Buckingham's work on editing the journal. She's done an amazing job of bringing it up to date and making sure that it's available, and open access is a big, huge opportunity for us as scholars as well. I did have some technical difficulties before we started, so hopefully that won't go on again, but hopefully you can bear with me if it does happen. The other thing is that my children might suddenly interrupt this. The articles, I'm just going to speak extemporaneously about the article. The article's title is Faith, Hope, and Power. More specifically, Corporatism, Ideology, and Religious Freedom in China from Mao to Xi. The reason that I took this on, a couple of things. At the International Institute for Religious Freedom in Vancouver, we'd like to do some occasional papers on a few focus countries, and the most important focus countries to my mind today are the two largest countries in the world, India and China. The other thing is that I had a research assistant who was from Taiwan, so that was helpful as well. I wanted to take a look at the Chinese context with regard to interest representation, which is a common theme throughout my work. So interest representation is probably an important thing to start with. When I talk about interest representation, political scientists traditionally have understood it either as coming from sort of the bottom up, and representing people's interests in a self-constituted way. We call this the form of pluralism. So you may have used the term pluralism in a variety of different ways, but the way that I use pluralism is a structural or systemic way where groups organize themselves to represent themselves to the state. That's self-constituted interest representation toward the state. That's what I mean by the term pluralism. Probably more importantly for this article, the opposite is where the state cultivates groups and determines their form of interest representation. And political scientists refer to this as corporatism or state corporatism. Important, I think, to make sure that you understand what I mean by that, because I think this word corporatism is in probably more common parlance used in other ways. It has nothing to do with corporations. It has nothing to do with businesses as such interacting with the state. It has entirely to do with the way that the state cultivates interest representation among civil society, among groups within civil society. And it means that the state takes the lead in organizing group interests. So you have one form of interest representation where people represent their own interests, and then another form where the state decides how they will represent their interests and cultivates this. Now, there are some fairly benign forms of corporatism around the world. The one that I often talk about with regard to religion is in Central Europe or in places like Germany, where you have the government recognizes a particular representative of the churches, for example, and state church tax goes to those organizations. But in the People's Republic of China, state corporatism takes the form of colonization of civil society, where the state is very determined to control and take over all forms of civil society, including religion, and of course, perhaps in some ways, most importantly, religion. So the article takes a look at corporatism as the theme for how the Chinese state organizes and controls religion in terms of its religious practice within China. It starts essentially with the question, is the Chinese state moving toward a renewal of the kind of repression that existed under Mao? And of course, I think we tend to think back of the period of the Maoist period as an extremely repressive form of control. But even under Mao, there was a lot of give and take. There was a lot of change over time. So over the first sort of decade and a half of the People's Republic, under Mao's control, the People's Republic was repressive toward religion and began its official form of corporatism, where the only tolerated forms of Christianity, of any religion, I should say, were under the the banner of what was called the three self churches, the self-propagating, self-governing, promoting. I can't remember what the third self is. Under the three self churches, the People's Republic tolerated very particular forms of religion. Essentially, there's 5 different forms of religion that were tolerated, and they created both a Roman Catholic association and a Protestant association of Christian churches. Under this period, in other words, it was possible to organize as Christians, although you had officially to be registered and controlled by the state in order to do so. Of course, fairly soon, many dissident forms of Christianity emerged to challenge this and created what are now become a much more important phenomenon of religion, probably in China, which is the independent churches that exist underground or in houses or house churches. So that developed under Mao. And then, of course, during the period from 1966 to 1976, repression was deepened. Now, of course, it was not just about religion during the period of 1966 and 1976. During this period, it was about everything. Anybody who has recently seen the Three-Body Problem, the television show that just came out, will know a little bit about what happened during the Cultural Revolution, because it figures fairly significantly in that show. And of course, for all forms of religion were essentially banned during the period of the Cultural Revolution from 1966 to 1976, and many of the leaders of the church were forced into work camps in the interior of China during this period, and ironically, many of them will say, in fact, this actually created the seed of a lot of the independent churches that exist today, because this actually gave opportunity to some of the independent church leaders to gather a following in the work camps, or in the what essentially were concentration camps during the period of the Cultural Revolution. And then, of course, during the period, the interregnum then between Mao and Xi, if we can put it that way, or the period of the 1980s, 1990s, and the early 2000s, there was a lot of relaxation on the regulation of Christian activities, especially in China, which has led to an expansion, a massive expansion of the Christian church in China, and especially, again, among the house church movements. But this is actually also true within the three self churches as well, the Catholic and Protestant churches. So this took place throughout that time period. So the question is, with the advent of Xi Jinping, when he comes to power in the last decade and a half, has this seen a reversal of some of the tolerance that existed during the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s? And to what extent can we compare it to the period of Mao? There's a sort of common argument that is out there, and I think it's accurate to say that that Xi is not Mao, that he is not seeking to engage in the kind of deep repression that Mao accomplished under his later years. Again, I think that's accurate. What Xi's approach is to do is to strengthen the role of the Chinese Communist Party. So he uses the Chinese Communist Party, as we understand it in political science, we call this a transmission belt. He uses this as a transmission belt of his authority. Of course, he has cultivated a fairly strong cult of personality, just like Mao did, to the extent that he has seen to his thought being introduced into the Constitution So although it's common for the latest leader of the People's Republic of China to introduce their official ideology or their thought into the understanding of Chinese communism, there are only a few who are kind of specifically officially mentioned within the Constitution, and those are it starts with Marxist-Leninism, and then goes on to Mao and Xi Jinping, and then Deng Xiaoping, and now Xi has become part of the pantheon. So that indicates something of the expectations that he has of people understanding him as being a chief ideologue of the party. Another big part of this is the what's called sinicization exercise that he has really pursued under the aegis of the party as well. And one of the themes that I develop in the paper is that the People's Republic of China understands religion as being challenging, primarily because it's viewed as a foreign interloper. It's a foreign import. So if you can make the case that your religion is not foreign in its origins, then you do fairly well by comparison to others that are perceived to be foreign or imperialist imports. And of course, the opponents of the Chinese Communist Party back in the day, back in the 1930s, many of them were actually converts to Christianity, and there's a perception that this was a foreign influence that had taken over the nationalist party of the 1930s that was the opponent of the Chinese communists. So this has become a common theme, is that your religion is fine if it is Chinese and it has Chinese characteristics, but it's not fine if it does not have these Chinese characteristics. Well, what defines Chinese characteristics today? Of course, the the Chinese Communist Party is what defines what is Chinese characteristics. And so sinicization, as he understands it, has to do not just with making it sort of contextual, or that it is a part of the three self philosophy that the churches are led by Chinese, but also that it toes the line of the Chinese Communist Party, which is going to continually drive a wedge between independent churches, especially, and the Chinese Communist Party that operates and controls the state. I think the perception as well that independent churches especially have been a challenge to the authority of the Chinese Communist Party, and that therefore are an existential challenge to the authority of the Chinese Communist Party, has raised the concerns of Xi Jinping, who himself spent a lot of time in in areas where there are large numbers of Christians. And so he has seen to the increasing application of the authority of the Chinese Communist Party over religious practice in many of these locations. So I do a little bit of talking as well about the deeper implications of the more totalitarian implications of this project for Xi. And one of the things that leads to the title, for example, is that Xi does use the language of spirituality and faith fairly frequently in his conversations about the management of religion. And in particular, the title, just so I can give a quick explanation of the title, which is Faith, Hope, and Power. Let me just make sure I get the quote correct here. So Xi has more than once used a slogan to explain the renewal or the renaissance of the Chinese people under his leadership. And it is this: the people have faith, the nation has hope, and the country has power. So his embrace of this kind of talk about faith in his official pronouncements indicates a desire to kind of trample on the idea of spirituality. And he's cultivated, in a sense as well, some more official ties to the Chinese Buddhist Association to accomplish this. So I don't want to say that Xi wants to create a new religion exactly, but he does use the terminology of spirituality to try to cultivate the support and the special role that the Chinese Communist Party plays in managing religion in the People's Republic. The other thing that I mentioned and was cautioned along the way to not go too far with is the extent to which the Chinese Communist Party wants to rewrite Christianity, or is ideologically committed to trying to dictate the content, shall we say, of Christian teaching. Now, to an extent, this has always been the case. The three self-churches have their mandate is to make sure that people understand that the Chinese Communist Party is a part of the fabric of faith, as it were, in the People's Republic, and that therefore the content that is shared from the pulpit, for example, the theology of the three self-churches needs to support the existence and the continued management of the Chinese Communist Party. There have been some instances where the party has actually been caught trying to sort of dictate these terms in more dubious forms. The one example being the introduction of a new translation of the Bible from a Chinese communist perspective, where they entirely rewrite portions of the scripture. This might be the product of a few overzealous members of the party more than of Xi Jinping himself. And as such, that is unlikely to go too much further. Nevertheless, the extent to which the Chinese Communist Party would go to the lengths of actually trying to change the content of Christian theology, which again is not necessarily a fringe idea in a more general sense. It very commonly tries to cultivate at the seminary level or at the level of the pulpit, the idea that sermons should be used to serve the dominance of the party, and that they should be used to justify the dominance of the party. And so, say corporatism is the method by which the Chinese Communist Party government of the People's Republic continues to do this. So the overall theme of the article is to state that although there are significant changes that have been idiosyncratic, that have been specific to each of the different leaders that have taken power since Mao and up now until Xi, and those are significant and important ways in which religious freedom policy has been channeled, one overriding theme of the management of religion in China has been this theme of state corporatism. I think I'll leave it at that, and if there are any questions, I'll try to deal with them. Oh, I have, take a look at the chat and I can just deal with the questions themselves here. Oh, I don't see any actually. If anyone has a question, let me know.
Thank you very much, Paul. An article just came across my desk in the last couple of days talking about how the Chinese government is starting to take a role in theological education and controlling seminaries, who's admitted and what the curriculum is, as well as also controlling Christian publishing houses. And the narrative from the government is we want to ensure that there is high quality Christian material to read for people. But it is clearly also a means of controlling and you know, definitely the cynicization of even the Christian material that's available, that if you want to read legal Christian material in China, it has to be published by an authorized publishing house where all of the material has been vetted and approved as meeting the goals of that cynicization of Christianity. So just echoing that these things are being reported to be happening. It is rolling out over a period of time.
Yeah, I think one thing to mention is that so I discuss it as idiosyncratic, but the leadership determines the shape by which state corporatism is applied, right? So it starts with the leader, but then you can have it can go further at the lower levels, at the more grassroots levels. It can once the leader determines that, you know, we have a role to play in trying to actually alter the nature of people's theology, then, you know, lesser officials can really take that and run with it, as we've seen in the past. So, I mean, under Mao, not to disclaim his own authority, under the period of the Cultural Revolution, but it enabled a whole lot of people at the lower levels, a whole lot of lower level administrators, to do all sorts of things that were in prior ages not really done. So again, even if Xi is not necessarily behind every single instance of what's going on in different locations across the country, he sets the stage for it. And if he gives kind of permission for that to happen, and even encourages it by talking about spirituality and by talking about sinicization, then it does give a whole lot of freedom to lower level officials to intimidate, to make demands that are going to be deeper than what he might even have in mind.
We have a question for Professor Paul here in the Q&A.
Yeah, I see it. Okay. So the question is, how does Confucianism influence the Chinese Communist Party's ideology throughout time, and now Xi's ideology? What are the important elements of Confucianism applied in the Communist Party's ideology? That's an excellent question. Not as an expert in Confucianism, I will not try to go too far down this road, but I think that the primary thing about Confucianism that I understand as being influential in the Chinese Communist Party mentality, and we just talked about North Korea, where this is also very true. I think that Juche is very strongly influenced by a Confucian past. Again, not to implicate Confucius himself necessarily in Juche, but or in the Communist Party, but it is amenable to the idea of two things, which is harmony, right? So harmony is an important Confucian ideal. And so the Chinese Communist Party can harp upon that by saying that anybody who threatens harmony of the community is threatening the community, but also doing so at a moral level. It's immoral to threaten communal harmony, and the Chinese Communist Party defines that communal harmony, that community harmony. The other thing is that's common, of course, in Confucian thought is filial piety, or in other words, obedience, veneration of both the ancestors, but also of your family and of patriarchal members of the family, for example. And that's cultivated by the notion of the Chinese Communist Party as family and as of Xi himself as a kind of patriarchal figure. So all of those things are influential, I think, in the way that the Chinese Communist Party behaves. I think that's a really interesting question. It's something I'd like to develop a little bit further, actually, because as I say, I'm no expert on Confucianism, but I do know a little bit about it, and probably sufficient to just maybe get myself into trouble. But that's my answer.
Thank you, Professor.
Well, thank you very much, Paul. That is very interesting. And of course, China being such a large country is going to continue to be a major focus as we look at how this develops over time and the impact on the Christian church in China. So thank you. We're going to turn now to our third speaker, Dr. Werner Nell. Werner obtained his LLB and LLM degrees from University of Johannesburg and his LLD from the University of Pretoria, with his dissertation focused on religious persecution and religious freedom in the context of the International Criminal Court and human rights law. And his dissertation has been published by the IIRF and is available on the IIRF.global website for those who are interested in these topics. He's presented various papers at national and international conferences and published multiple peer-reviewed international journal articles with a focus on the intersection between religion and international law and related disciplines. He is also the book review editor for the International Journal for Religious Freedom. So if you have an interest in reviewing a book for the journal, and we welcome you to do so, you can contact Dr. Nell and he can obtain a complimentary copy of the book for you to review. So I'm not seeing, there he is. he is tuning in. Welcome, Werner. We look forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Janet. I did struggle a little bit with connectivity a little bit earlier, but unfortunately, your introduction now has just reminded me of a lot of work that I still need to do in regards to the book review. But anyway, so good afternoon from a sunny South Africa. It's late afternoon. I wish I was in Paul's shoes of it being an early morning. I'm more of an early morning person than I am a late afternoon person. But anyway, I'll start with a disclaimer. If you hear screams in the background, please be assured that I am not running a human trafficking syndicate or anything of that like. We do not condone domestic violence in our house, but the two kids don't always agree with that statement. So if you hear strange noises, that would be my two kids. I'm going to probably bore you with another session or another discussion that relates to COVID-19, and I'm going to try and share my screen. See, unfortunately, it is not a full screen. Okay, there we go. Okay, so usually, as Janet has mentioned, my research is in the context of international criminal law and international human rights law, and this is probably the first journal article that I've written that dabbles a little bit outside of that field, in that I wrote contextually here from a legal perspective in South Africa. But I'm pretty sure that many of the lessons that I've come across, or the concerns that I've listed, may well have been similar in other countries. So I have a bit of a presentation with a few slides, but I'll probably speak more from a personal perspective than anything else. I think the article doesn't necessarily portray that, because when you are writing in law, you're writing in an impartial, objective manner without taking sides most of the time. And so the article is written in that fashion, but it's very much about my own experience at a public university in South Africa with mandatory vaccination policies and everything that goes around that. And at that time, I was very much against forced vaccination. I don't see myself as I see myself as a skeptic. I don't see myself as an anti-vaxxer or as anything strange. Not that that's strange, but anything further than just being skeptic regarding the safety of vaccinations and early vaccinations following COVID-19. So I'm not going to speak about COVID-19, what it looked like in South Africa and those sorts of things. I'll save us that. But I will say that at that stage in our context, we were off campus, and the only way that you could get onto campus to be able to teach, to be able to do your work, to be able to access data and library resources, was for you to have a vaccination certificate. I was blocked at the gate of the university. I was unable to get into my office until I was willing to get this vaccination. And later, when there was the subsequent vaccination, the expectation was that you get the second one as well. And again, I found myself in a similar position. And I think from a spiritual perspective, it still bothers me that I had to, despite my conscientious objection to vaccination, that I was forced to get this vaccination. So that is something that I've struggled with, And ironically, I'm speaking about this in a time where I am essentially recuperating from what is likely a new variant of COVID-19. But anyway, so I'm going to share this journey or some of the frustrating things along the way from a legal point of view, and aspects that really bothers me in terms of what is going to happen the next time around. Are we going to learn from, and if I say we, I'm not necessarily speaking to this specific crowd. I'm saying I'm referring to governments. I'm referring to policymakers. Are we going to learn from the mistakes that we made during 2020, 2021, and so forth? Or are we going to repeat the same problem or the same issues, or are we going to learn from these sorts of mistakes that we made? And some of the mistakes or some of the missteps might not have necessarily been intentional. It may very well have been the fact that those drafting it didn't have sufficient knowledge on the ramifications, the human rights ramifications of what they are putting in writing. But the point is that whether COVID-19 was artificially engineered or naturally derived, it is very likely not going to be the last pandemic that humanity is going to face and will confront. And it's therefore necessary to learn from the missteps that was taken during that time and how it was approached and what was written. A lot of what was termed conspiracy theorists or theories during the time has in subsequent months and years been proven to be completely correct. It's not information that you'll find on mainstream media because mainstream media is not going to speak from a different voice that they did during the COVID-19 pandemic. But the information that has come out as a result or subsequent to the lifting of all of the different restrictions that we had during COVID speaks to the fact that a lot of the narrative that we had at that time was not correct, and it was based on all sorts of things, political reasons and so forth, which I won't dabble in. And I'm also not going to speak about the constitutional justifiability of the vaccination policies in South Africa. The Constitutional Court never adjudicated on this matter, so it would be speculation on my side. And probably there's room there for an article by itself. So I'll leave that discussion there. But what I will speak to very briefly, and I don't want to spoil the enjoyment of reading the article if you are still interested in reading anything on the COVID-19 pandemic and religious freedom. But I won't go through the article in detail, but I will mention a few things. And the idea is to highlight some of the consequences that mandatory vaccination policies at South African universities had for the individual's conscience, religion, and so forth. So although these mandatory vaccination policies had made provision for reasonable accommodation on the basis of religion, the formulation of these mandates were quite restrictive. And I'll have a brief look at one very restrictive policy just to illustrate that point. So I'm going to move on. I've spoken already about those issues. I want to mention just very briefly maybe a few important things regarding religious freedom in South Africa, just to give some context. So the first important thing is that our constitution follows from a very dark era of apartheid in South Africa. And the reason why that is important is because it has influenced the hermeneutical lens, the contextual lens through which decisions are made, policies are formed, and even the Constitutional Court makes decisions in matters that often include religious freedom. So this contextual lens is very much about social justice, making sure that we fix the issues and the infringements of the past those sorts of things. And although the Constitutional Court doesn't often rely on the term Ubuntu, that African philosophy of Ubuntu is very much part of the understanding of how the court interprets social justice in South Africa. The next important thing is just to mention that our Constitution does provide strong protection for human rights, being a very contemporary Constitution. And from that point of view, others might disagree with me, but my feeling is that at least in its substantive form, South Africa does have a constitutional constitutional secularity. In the sense that it infers inclusivity, and it epitomizes an open-mindedness towards religious pluralism. In other words, pluralism, freedom of different beliefs or thoughts, not limited to specific types of religious beliefs at all. And also a neutral religion-state relationship. So in South Africa, there's not this strict separation between state and religion. In fact, the state is allowed to have, at least to a limited extent, to have a certain form of belief, provided that it treats all religious beliefs or treats all beliefs equally. And then the other very important aspect in this regard is that there's a strong emphasis in South Africa, because of the contextual pass, on an absence of coercion or constraint. So even if the government has an inclination towards a specific belief, it is very important that doesn't filter through into society where people feel forced to come to a specific belief or have a certain specific belief. Also, a very important aspect in our South African context is the non-entanglement doctrine, which very much is about this relationship between the state and religion and religious beliefs in South Africa. So South African courts, according to our case law, should not embark upon evaluation of the acceptability, the logic, the consistency, or the comprehensibility of a belief. So as a result, our human rights jurisprudence in South Africa reveals a measure of restraint when it comes to disputes, especially when it comes to internal matters of doctrine of a specific religion or a specific religious group. So despite the fact that our Constitution and the Constitutional Court being the highest authority in South Africa, it generally does not dabble in anything that relates to a religious organization or religious community's doctrine or ideology. The final point there is just to mention that in our Constitution, religious freedom is not a standalone. It's listed together with conscience, religion, belief, thought, opinion, and so forth. So it has a wide spectrum, and those kind of speak to each other. That is specific in terms of section 15, but we've got other sections in the Constitution that also protects other aspects, interrelated human rights aspects, to make sure that that adherents have of available. So it would include the freedom to hold a religion, to practice a religion, to express a religious view, an opinion, and so forth. So the protection is quite broad, and it's quite strong. The next point so that just gives us a very brief background of religious freedom and the protection of religious freedom in South Africa. So that brings me to the reasoning behind public university MVPs, so the mandatory vaccination policies. This is something that might have looked a little bit different in other countries. Our government never made the official decision to enforce mandatory vaccination policies at a national level. And to some extent, that might have been a better idea than what we ended up with, being workplace MVPs. And the problem with workplace MVPs is that it was absolutely left to each workplace, each employer to decide for that institution whether it is necessary under the circumstances, depending on the type of work that is done at that institution or that workplace, whether a vaccination policy, COVID vaccination policy was necessary, yes or no. So I would suggest that by far the majority of employers in South Africa decided against a mandatory vaccination policy, but you ended up with pockets of vaccination policies at different workplaces. And the frustrating thing with that being that within a society, a small portion was forced by their workplace to be vaccinated. And because it's mandatory, it would have been against their will if they had an objection to that, as I did. And you would come home, as I did, and my wife's workplace had no concerns with mandatory vaccination. So you would find yourself in a position where you, on the one hand, you are forced to be able to do your work to get a vaccination. You get home and you have family members that are not vaccinated. And as we know now, getting the vaccination did not imply that I was immune to getting another strain of COVID-19. So I get the vaccination, forced to get the vaccination, come home, and I potentially could either bring home the COVID being infected myself, bring that home, or be infected by siblings, by family members, my kids that got it from school. So it didn't make a lot of sense to me that we had these pockets of forced vaccination. It would have made more sense at a national level. So that is just how it worked in South Africa. Now, in South Africa, public universities are considered organs of state. So they aren't only social justice institutions, they essentially are speaking on behalf, to at least a certain extent, on behalf of the state. So they end up representing the government's stance in relation to certain things, and maybe mandatory vaccination was one of them. But the government in South Africa never took a firm stance against or for a mandatory vaccination policy. So what public universities did was they argued that because of their social justice role in society, and because they are organs of state, that they have this social duty towards the interest of the public. And so they justified the blanket limitation of individual rights. So in essence, what they did was they were saying that in balancing the collective right of the community to health and safety and other things, balancing that against the individual's right to bodily integrity, to freedom of religion, belief, and opinion, and so forth, they assumed that the prevailing view was that the collective right and the rights of the collective would take precedence. And so there are a number of concerns with that kind of view. If you are taking that kind of stance, but it only affects specific individuals that work at that specific institution and the students that attend at that institution. But as I said earlier, those same individuals go back home into pockets that are not immunized, by any sort of vaccination. It just doesn't make a lot of sense. Sorry. So I'm going to speak very briefly only of some of the interpretive consequences for religious freedom, especially for individual religious freedom. But before I do, I want to illustrate one policy. And from showing you this policy, it should already become clear how the thinking, where I would dare to say that there was objective thinking about how we should approach mandatory vaccination policies and how there should be exceptions and how these exceptions should work. but the terminology and the phrasing, the formulation of these policies just didn't make a lot of sense. So let me just dabble a little bit in UJ's policy. So in this regard, we had an exemptions committee, and in all instances where public universities made this mandatory, the vaccination policy mandatory, there was a wide discretion given to different variants of exemptions committees. And these committees were made up of individuals within the university representing the university, so they were not objective at all. So the role here of the exemption committees, they had a wide discretion to determine the entire exemptions framework. They were able to decide everything regarding how exemptions would work, how the framework would work, what procedures need to be followed, the standard of proof, the extent of proof, the type of evidence that was acceptable to support a specific exemption application. And they even went as far, and I'll show you in a moment, as to dictate the acceptability of what would be considered religious doctrine or religious ideology that justifies an application on religious exemption. They also had a wide discretion to determine, having considered an applicant's application, whether that applicant's rights are justifiably limited by mandatory vaccination. So the concern here is the burden of proof rested on the individual applicant to show why they should be granted reasonable accommodation. And they had to provide a motivation in writing for exemption. And this had to be based on a seriously held religious belief. How do you test that? How does a secular exemptions committee test whether a held belief or a so-called held belief is held seriously? Are they going to ask me questions? No, of course not. It was COVID, so it was very much based on what they found in their documentation, whether they believed that there was a seriously held religious belief that materially conflicts with vaccination. Then they expected there to be relevant information and supporting documentation. I remember on the previous slide I mentioned that they dictated what they accepted as evidence and as proof of this specific situation. So just to give you an example, so they requested or they required a written motivation that demonstrated that the vaccination represents an unavoidable and serious conflict with the applicant's religious beliefs. That sounds fair enough. Then they say whether the subjective beliefs, these subjective beliefs of the applicant, are aligned with or have some relation to the accepted doctrines, widely adopted practices, and known philosophical or theological underpinnings of a particular religion. In other words, while they mention the fact that each applicant would have a subjective religious belief, they essentially say that you cannot have that religious belief outside that of a mainstream religious ideology or doctrine. It had to fit very neatly into the box set out for a specific religion or a specific belief. So what they then expected you to do to prove all of this was to substantiate these beliefs and that it forms part of a religious, a larger religious community, or the beliefs of a larger religious community or religion itself, by being able to provide an affidavit from a senior religious leader from within your religious community. And it had to set out the key tenets of the religion on which this claim for exemption or the application for exemption and the call not to be vaccinated. What justified, what in the religion justifies doctrinally this objection? Now, in South Africa, as I think most instances in the world, or most places in the world, very few religious leaders, very few religious denominations were willing to say, but we take a hard, firm stance on behalf of all of our adherents against vaccination. I mean, depending on each context, there were, in Canada, for example, certain pastors were arrested for violating certain COVID rules. Churches could have lost funding from the state as a result of things like that. Zoning rights, all of these things were possible results if churches did not, and other religious groups did not stay within what was said by government to be the law. So very few religious leaders would have been willing to put their name on writing and say, but this is part of religious doctrine. So it was left to each individual. And I think that is where the big concern occurred. So I'm going to just mention two notable inadequacies of this formulation. I think most of the inadequacies speak for themselves, but I'll speak to two important ones in my mind. The first one is that in a pluralist society such as South Africa, it is not for a secular polity, a university or a university exemption committee, as was the case here. It is not for that kind of institution to exercise the discretion, the wide discretion, to determine the doctrinal acceptability, the scientific logic, the rationality, or the centrality of an individual's existential views. It is not for an exemptions committee to decide whether a specific view falls within an acceptable religious doctrine or ideology. How can you expect a secular institution or a secular body to make a kind of decision on an existential worldview on behalf of someone else? So the secular polity in South Africa, including, and this is what the Constitutional Court has said, is not an existential entity capable, never should it ever dabble within this area of what is and what is not within a person or within a religious community's doctrine, religious doctrine or religious views. And this comes back to the non-entanglement doctrine that I spoke about a little bit earlier. So it is not for the court, never mind for secular polity, to decide what is a serious belief or a serious ideology or what is central to a person's beliefs. However, that is exactly
Werner, can I just encourage you to wrap it up? We are at about time for the webinar. So if I could just encourage you to just wrap up over the next couple of minutes, that would be great.
Perfect.
Thank you so much.
I'll just make my final point here, and then it's closely related to the first one. So essentially what happened in this regard was that MVPs of public universities did not allow for individual religious self-determination. What I mean with that is there's always going to be a certain margin of aberration from religious doctrine. Even if I'm part of a specific religious community or religious group, there are certain things that I might not necessarily agree with within that group. And I think that is fine. I think the Constitution allows us to a certain limited extent, disagree with certain doctrines within our own religious communities or views. But that was not allowed in terms of these MVPs. And the concern there is that there is very little protection for individual views that don't fall neatly within the larger scope of a certain religious group or doctrine or ideology. And unfortunately, that meant that it ended up in discrimination against not only those that couldn't justify the application based on a specific religious doctrine, but also those that had secular, conscious-based concerns, atheists who might have had very much merited conscious-based concerns, but this did not fall within the parameters of what was conceived to be religious grounds. So it did result, unfortunately, in a great deal of discrimination. There are others that that I do discuss in the article itself. But those, I think, are the two main ones. And yeah, I'll leave things there. I don't need to make any concluding remarks in that regard. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Werner. And, you know, while I think we are all happy to not have the restrictions of COVID-19 on us any longer, it was the largest, most widespread violation of religious freedom that we have seen in our lifetimes, and hopefully that we will see in our lifetimes. And so I think there will continue to be a great deal of discussion and to see the principles behind what we saw with the violations of religious freedom, not only for churches, but for Christians in the workplace. So thank you very much for that. Marcella, over to you for concluding remarks.
Thank you. Well, before we finish, we have one question in the Q&A. Maybe Werner, you want to answer it? Shortly, maybe.
Thank you. Yes, I see the comment there from Michael. Do you see mandatory vaccination as a religious freedom issue or a bodily autonomy issue? I think it's a little bit of both, to be honest. I think if we think about the kind of decision that was made during COVID regarding mandatory vaccination policies or mandatory vaccination or vaccination in general, it's not just a bodily integrity decision that is made there. It is very much based on religious identity. And so from that point of view, you could make the argument that it's very much a human dignity issue at stake here. It's not just religious freedom or bodily integrity. It's a holistic thing. It considers decisions that is made from a conscious perspective regarding my own body, which speaks to my human dignity. So from this point of view, I made the argument that I think that it doesn't purely belong in a collective religious perspective. It was an individual decision in most instances, because as you rightly mentioned, there were very few tenets of faith that do speak to this. There are certain religious communities, yes, they do speak very directly about certain types of vaccinations. But there are also believers, conscious-based believers, whether that is religious or secular beliefs, that have, from a conscious perspective, a human dignity perspective, certain concerns with this type of vaccination. And so therefore, I don't think it should have been limited or should be limited ever only to a religion context. It is broader than that. Our idea of religion is broader than that. And therefore, I think it should have taken a much broader view than just purely, is there religious doctrine that justifies your claim for exemption? I hope that answers your question, Michael.
Okay, thank you, Professor Werner. Thank you for all the speakers for sharing with us these remarks about your articles. We invite you, all the attendees, to visit the website of the International Journal for Religious Freedom, the IIRF.org. And we, as the International Institute for Religious Freedom, we are very pleased and we are very thankful for your attendance. And we invite you for the next webinars that we are going to announce in the next weeks, because this is a serial of webinars where we are trying to share to attendees and to all the people that we can reach about the importance of learning as the study of religious freedom in different contexts. We're very thankful for with all of you, because you have shared with us different insights about what we are talking about religious freedom in different contexts, in different regions. Maybe these are very different scenarios that we wouldn't be knowing what's going on the other side of the world if you wouldn't be researching about this topic. So we are very thankful for your time, for your disposition, and for participate in this activity from the International Institute. So I know you have final words to share with the attendees before we finish.
I just encourage you to go to the IIRF.org website and have a look at the journal. And if you are so inclined, we would be happy to receive any submissions of articles or book reviews that you have for us. But you will find a wealth of very interesting articles on the website. So thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay.